φυσικά παρόντες και παρόντες. Από ό,τι βλέπω έχουμε 19 τηλεπαρόντες μαζί μας. Φτάσαμε αισίως στην πρώτη τελευταία ομιλία του Κλασικού Σεμιναρίου για φέτος. Οφείλω να σας πω ότι θα έχουμε και επιπλέον εκδηλώσεις μέχρι τον Ιούνιο, εμβόλυμες διαλέξεις. Σήμερα όμως είμαστε ιδιαίτερα ευτυχείς που έχουμε μαζί μας την συνάδελφο Dr. Amelia Brown. Έρχεται από την Αυστραλία, ταξίδεψε από την Αυστραλία όχι μόνο για τη σημερινή εκδήλωση, αλλά στα πλαίσια του ερευνητικού της προγράμματος, το οποίο νομίζω θα σας ενημερώσει γι' αυτό και κατά τη διάρκεια της ομιλίας της. Ως συνήθως θα ξεκινήσουμε με λίγα λόγια για την ομιλήτρια και στη συνέχεια η διάρκεια της ομιλίας θα είναι περίπου 45 λεπτά και στη συνέχεια θα υπάρξουν ερωτήσεις. Η Amelia Brown είναι λέκτρας ελληνικής ιστορίας και γλώσσας στο τμήμα Κλασικών Σπουδών και Αρχαίας Ιστορίας της Σχολής Ιστορίας, Φιλοσοφίας, Θρησκείας και Κλασικών Σπουδών του Πανεπιστημίου του Queensland στην Αυστραλία. Είναι κάτοχος διδακτορικού τίτλου στην Αρχαία Ιστορία και Μεσογειακή Αρχαιολογία από το Πανεπιστήμιο του Berkeley. Σπούδασε επίσης στο πρόγραμμα Ελληνικών Σπουδών του Πανεπιστημίου Princeton και στο Μουσείο Βυζαντινού Πολιτισμού στη Θεσσαλονίκη. Έχει εργαστεί σε ανασκαφές στην πόλη Χρυσοχού στην Κύπρο, στην Κόρινθο, την αρχαία Μεσίνη, στην Γκο και στα Κύθυρα. Τα ερευνητικά της ενδιαφέροντα περιλαμβάνουν την ύστερη αρχαιότητα στην Ελλάδα και την αυτιλιακή ιστορία της Ανατολικής Μεσογείου. Σήμερα η ομιλία της έχει τίτλο «Η μετατροπή των ναών σε εκκλησίες στην ύστερη αρχαιότητα, πρακτικότητα ή ιδεολογία» ή «The conversion of temples to churches in Late Antiquity, Practicality or Ideology». Amelia.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Thank you very much. In my talk today, I'll be discussing one of the most important and long-standing questions in the study of late antiquity. That is the conversion of both people and then of buildings and landscapes to Christianity in the course of the 4th to 7th centuries AD. This was a conversion from age-old beliefs, worship practices, and buildings of traditional polytheistic religion, what was called often derogatorily pagan religion, that is the old gods and goddesses Zeus, Aphrodite, Athena, and the practices of worshiping them with offerings made in and around temples. In the 300 years or so between Constantine's edict of toleration of Christianity in the early 4th century to the rise of Islam in the early 7th century, the population of the later Roman Empire experienced widespread individual and mass conversion to Christianity, by choice and also increasingly by law. But from the very first purpose-built churches put in Rome, in Constantinople, and in Jerusalem, the built landscape of the ancient world was also converted, both by the active construction of new churches and by the abandonment, the demolition, and the conversion of existing temples, sanctuaries, and shrines. My presentation tonight focuses on balancing the textual and the archaeological evidence for the conversion of the most famous ancient Greek temples and sanctuaries to Christian use, from the Parthenon in Athens to the famous sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia. This evidence helps us to understand the many motivations and mechanisms of conversion in late antiquity, from the practical to the ideological, and it sheds light on how architecture, religious culture, and people of the ancient world were completely transformed in the space of a few centuries into the Christian society of the Middle Ages, the legacy of which continues today. Next slide. I'd like to begin with two quotations from ancient texts, one Greek and one Latin, both of the 4th century AD, which display some of the ideology expressed in writing in late antiquity about conversion of people and the landscape. In the year 364, just after Julian, the last pagan emperor, met his fate in the east, the noted orator Themistius gave a speech with advice to the new emperor Jovian, including this simile comparing pagans and Christians as athletes competing in a running race for the same prize. A complete absence of competition fills us with lethargy and boredom. This is man's age-old nature, and the saying, "One man sacrificed to one, one to another of the gods," is older than Homer, for it has never been pleasing to God for such a harmony to exist among men. Themistius then went on to praise the wisdom of the new emperor Jovian for encouraging this religious competitiveness in his subjects. In fact, this and many ancient texts show the continuous presence of the cultural ideal of philotimia, love of competition, throughout late antiquity, not just among the pagans, but among Christians too. Next slide. Also, in the Western Empire, we find the dedicatory inscription set up in the Basilica of St. Agnes near Rome by Constantine's daughter Constantina, striking a self-conscious competitive note. It declares, "I, Constantina, venerating God and dedicated to Christ, having provided all the expenses with devoted mind at divine bidding and with the great help of Christ, consecrated this templum of Agnes, victorious Virgin, because she has prevailed over the temples and all earthly works, here where the loftiest roof gleams with gold." So these two textual evocations of the ancient spirit of competition can serve as a starting point for my main question tonight, a question for which there are few direct literary sources. That is, the ideology of the conversion of the most famous ancient Greek temples and sanctuaries to the use of the Christian church. These texts remind us that monotheism brought a new claim for exclusivity, but it also brought a diversity of opinions about its relationship to the old gods. Was the Christian God more powerful than the old gods, or did the old gods just not exist? Did Christians see themselves as competing with the old religion, or was it simply old-fashioned and destined to fade away? Next slide. Despite these expressions of competition from the 4th century, active competition for control of pagan temples and sanctuaries in Greece in late antiquity is either passed over in silence or actively denied by much modern scholarship, with some important exceptions. While the details of the drawn-out, active, and sometimes violent struggle over ancient sacred sites is clear for some famous places like Rome or Alexandria, the Roman province of Achaia, ancient southern Greece, from the Peloponnese in the south up to the area of Thermopylae in the north, this area suffers from problems of a lack of well-dated evidence and a lack of literary sources in late antiquity. At the end of the 3rd century AD, most Pan-Hellenic and civic sanctuaries and temples were still active sites of celebration for Greeks and visitors from all over the Mediterranean. And these celebrations of festivals, sacrifices, and worship of the gods were integral aspects of ancient Greek identity. But by the middle of the 6th century, every major Greek sanctuary contained at least one Christian church. And by the 7th century, most temples were either converted into churches or on their way to ruin. But the sharp decline in literary sources and the nature of 19th and 20th century classical archaeology has continued to help and hinder our process of understanding how the sanctuaries and the shrines fell out of pagan use and became the site of Christian worship. Even the last centuries of activity at the famous places, the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, the Sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia, the Acropolis in Athens, remains obscure for these reasons. Did Christians grapple violently with pagans for possession of these sites, coexist and compete for a time, or simply move into the ruins long after the pagans had disappeared, leaving now meaningless heaps of stone behind them? I will be conducting a thorough examination of archaeological and historical data from Delphi, Olympia, and Athens tonight to reveal a very complicated picture. But I believe it is defensible that you can make the conclusions given this evidence that quite reverse the quiet twilight of the gods sometimes envisioned. These places were all actively contested by both local and outside people throughout the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. The competition over ancient sacred space characterized the last centuries of traditional Greek religion and the first centuries of Greek Christianity. At the Panhellenic sanctuaries of Delphi and Olympia, there were large basilica churches built or converted in very significant locations. On the Acropolis at Athens, as well as in the Agora and in other city centers, famous temples like the Parthenon were actively remodeled for conversion to Christian churches in the 6th or 7th century. It is these case studies I'd like to move on to now. Excellent. To begin with, Delphi in late antiquity. The splendid view of the ruined, excavated, and restored sanctuary, which appears today from the main road to travelers from the east, still is the traces of the sanctuary as it appeared in the middle of the 2nd century to the ancient travel writer Pausanias, writing about his own approach from the east by the overland road from Livadia. Up the hill, past, in his day, ruined or empty treasuries, to the still functioning temple of Athena in front of the sanctuary, and the gymnasium and the Castalian spring, where the ancient city of Delphi was then located, just in front of and around the sanctuary itself with its central temple of Apollo. In the 6th century, at the gateway of the sanctuary, he would have been standing in front of a monumental Christian church, which has entirely disappeared today, but which entirely changed the landscape of the site by the 6th century. What happened then between Pausanias and the 6th century? And how did Christian churches replace Apollo's Pythia on her tripod? Next slide. In the 4th century, there was a lot of action at the site of Delphi. Pausanias is a starting point, but we also have quite good contemporary evidence for the 4th century, an era when Delphi was filled with enormous quantities of dedications, large and small, but also a sanctuary which required constant upkeep and maintenance, while the ancient buildings were in danger of falling into disrepair. There are honorific inscriptions, architectural fragments, but also attacks by Christians happening in this era. Despite his plundering of many important dedications from the sanctuary at Delphi, like the serpent column of Plataea removed to his new hippodrome at Constantinople, the Emperor Constantine was honored twice at Delphi, probably posthumously, and still by a Hierapolis, a sacred city. Then 50 years later, his successor and nephew, the last pagan emperor Julian, regretted Delphi's decline in writing and exempted the Delphians from taxation. He was also the recipient of this extremely foreboding oracle, which has been attributed also to Apollo at Daphne near Antioch, rather than to Apollo at Delphi. The last Roman emperors honored with statues at Delphi are Valens and Valentinian between 364 and 371. Next. In the 5th century, Delphi sought to renew its tax exemption under Theodosius II, still as an old-fashioned traditional sanctuary site. But the tombstone of a deaconess, Athanasia, records the arrival of Christians in the village too, and a bishop who gave her her office. This tombstone of Athanasia is the last ancient inscription from Delphi, apart from the abundant cross graffiti covering the altar of the Chians, and also the inscriptions on the mosaic floors of the churches that would be built in the 5th and 6th centuries. Next. Archaeology shows continued prosperity at the site of Delphi in the 3rd and 4th century. The Temple of Apollo was never converted into a church, but it suffered from a fire in the 4th century and was repaired, perhaps by Julian. The altars, both inside and outside the temple, then disappeared in the 5th or 6th century. And in the building itself, the adyton, or inner chamber, where the Pythia once sat, was deliberately smashed up, with stones pulled out and clamps removed. The Temple of Apollo then continued to stand into the 6th century, as surrounding buildings were converted to new uses, and baths, cisterns, fountains, and monumental structures constructed too. Next. Typical of these large-scale buildings of late antique Delphi is the so-called Roman agora, which runs across the south side of the sanctuary, a terrace with colonnades on 3 sides and shops on the north. This is the area now used for displaying the large amounts of Christian sculpture found in and around the sanctuary by the French excavations. Next. In fact, at least 3 new churches were built in Delphi in late antiquity, although all are utterly ruined today. 2 probably belong to the 6th century and were built upon the eastern and western approaches to the sanctuary and the town. They are identified on this map of the site as St. Elias in the west and St. George in the south. And you can see them on either side of the modern museum. However, extensive but fragmentary remains of at least 1 other basilica church were also found scattered throughout the site by the 19th century excavations. This last church was built a bit earlier, perhaps between 450 and 500, with much greater care, monumentality, and expense than the later 2. It was perhaps even on the terrace above the temple itself, or somewhere below it. It was so thoroughly destroyed in the Middle Ages, though, that its original location is unclear. In the 10th century, its architectural members and its columns were used to build the neighboring monastery of Hosios Lukas, and its remnants were not localized closely enough that its foundation could be found. The mosaic on the right-hand side of the slide comes from excavations in the 1960s to the west of the sanctuary, and is the best preserved of the mosaic floors we have today. Much of the original pagan statuary, however, was left in place in Delphi during these centuries. There was progressive construction then of churches, but there was also respecting to a certain extent of the Temple of Apollo until it collapsed for the last time in the 6th century and covered the sacred way and was not cleared away. The temple also was joined in ruin by the basilica churches, all of which were ruined in the Middle Ages and were therefore available to serve for the construction of Hosios Lukas. So was there coexistence at Delphi or competition, or both, and how would we know? Next slide. We can compare Delphi and the sanctuary of Apollo there with the more clearly understood sanctuary of Apollo at Daphne near Antioch. There, in the course of his short reign, Julian disrupted the worship of pagans and Christians side by side. And in the case of Daphne near Antioch, the remains of a local martyr named Babylos had been translated to the site by Julian's own brother, Gallus. Julian then removed Babylos from the sanctuary, supposedly at the request of Apollo, and tried to reinstitute the festival. However, the Temple of Apollo was destroyed by a fire, and Julian, of course, was killed. A few years later, then, the famed orator and church father, St. John Chrysostom, preached the Christian perspective on these events at Antioch, and interpreted the temple fire as the triumph of Babylos, not only over Julian, but also over Apollo himself. Rather than deny the existence of Apollo, St. John Chrysostom argued to Christians and perhaps pagans in his audience too, that the martyr Babylos, and hence Christ, was simply more powerful than the god Apollo could ever be. In light of events at the shrine, this must have been a very persuasive argument indeed, and it perhaps suggests how a series of events and interpretations, the growth of a Christian hierarchy and the construction of churches, could redefine sacred space as Christian without denying the existence of the old gods. Next slide. When we move from Delphi to Olympia, will we find a similar pattern? In late antiquity, Olympia was still the site of the most famous competitive games in all the Roman Empire, and the main sanctuary for the worship of Olympian Zeus. Until recently, the effects of an earthquake were interpreted as evidence of the barbarian tribe of the Herulians penetrating to the sanctuary in the 3rd century and causing the destruction of the site. However, more recent excavations in the 20th century have discovered clear inscriptions and construction testifying to repairs to the sanctuary in the 3rd century and the continued celebration of the games throughout the 4th century, certain from victor lists and archaeology. Next. This is the athletes' clubhouse, and most of the buildings, like this one, from late antiquity, and like Delphi, lie on the outskirts of the sanctuary where there was still room to build. These include baths, guest houses, and this clubhouse where a bronze tablet was found recently listing Olympic victors down to Zopyros of Athens at the 291st Olympiad in 385. All this new construction caused erosion along the banks of the rivers, which began to flood more often, but it also does testify to the popularity of the site in the 4th century. Next. In the 5th century, then, what happened? There is debate about the last year the Olympic Games were actually held, with ancient historians ranging in date from the late 4th to the early 5th century, depending on which laws of the Roman emperors are believed to have caused the end of the festival. Themisius says he saw Phidias's chryselephantine statue of Zeus in the temple at Olympia in 384. And then it is said to have been moved to the palace of Lausus in Constantinople in the year 475, and later destroyed there by fire. No traces of this statue have been found in the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, or in Constantinople for that matter, but evidence for pagan cult does continue at the site into the early 5th century, and the temple and the sanctuary buildings stood undamaged into the later 5th century. There are many earlier precedents for statue removal from the era of Roman expansion into Greece, when cult statues and dedications were taken by the hundreds by the Romans, first as trophies and then as art objects. While these losses were a clear indication of the loss of Greek political power, they did not necessarily affect religious sentiment at a local level or Roman patronage of Greek shrines. However, the acquisition of famous statues enhanced Roman prestige greatly, especially when they were set up in public, as was often the case at Rome. It is in this imperial and public tradition, along with a new Christian zeal for removal of cult images, that Constantine and his successors continued to take religious objects, like the statue of Olympian Zeus, from Greece and erect them in the new Rome at Constantinople. But while the serpent tripod from Delphi that had been taken by Constantine was not an image of a god, this figure was the greatest of all gods, the Phidian statue of Olympian Zeus, in scale and workmanship unique, a figure imbued with reverence, worshipped for almost a millennium as the embodiment of the king and father of the gods. His loss must have made a difference to the sanctity of the temple of Zeus at Olympia in the late 5th century. Next. In the 5th century, truly secular buildings without any festival function also appear more and more in the sanctuary of Zeus and nearby, followed by Christian tombs and lamps, and then a Christian church, not a new building, but a conversion of the large hall to the west of the Temple of Zeus, on the same east-west axis with the same interior dimensions as the temple. This building, the workshop of Phidias, also known as Building A or the Pantheon, had a nave like the temple and like basilica churches with 2 aisles separated by colonnades, about 30 by 15 meters. The excavators identified it as the workshop of Phidias on the basis of finds of ivory, gold, terracotta molds, and a cup inscribed with Phidias' name. However, according to Pausanias, in the 2nd century it was used as a pantheon and stood across from the main gatehouse just outside the main southwest gate to the inner sanctuary. You can see on the map. Next. Pausanias says this location was where the processional road goes in, the only road for processions. So it was an important, significant place in the sanctuary, but not inside the sanctuary proper. This is the place in the 6th century that the locals of Olympia, the Christians, chose to modify for worship, lining the inside with marble slabs, constructing an eastern apse, and opening a new entrance as well. Christians who converted such a pantheon of temple proportions at the main processional entrance to the most famous ancient sanctuary of Zeus surely did not choose this building only for reasons of economy. Even areas around the altar itself were considered sacred, and the choice of this building argues strongly for some religious competition on the part of the Christians, if only with the memory of Zeus, whose statue was long gone. Next. You can see today the inside and the outside of the church building after excavation. Even if pagan worship had ended in this pantheon, in the 5th century the temple of Zeus was still standing, and the image of Zeus had only recently been removed. Also in the 5th century, next, there was an important modification to the site at Olympia, the construction of a fortification wall. This wall, however, did not include the church or the building that was to become the church, depending on the dating, but this fortification wall, now removed, actually enclosed the temple of Zeus and some buildings to its south. At first, it was probably for protection of the local townspeople from invaders, but it shows that the temple of Zeus was considered important enough to put inside rather than left outside. The inhabitants of Olympia also did not desecrate the pediment sculpture of the building. We can still see the head of Apollo, for example, in the pediment sculpture as preserved. It was in late antiquity, however, that earthquakes, floods, and some degree of human agency did cause the end of use of the site of Olympia, but it was an end of all use, not just pagan, but Christian too. And the Christians' church, along with the temple of Zeus, were all flooded and covered with sediment together in the 7th and 8th centuries. By the 9th century, the whole site was covered with about 15 feet of river sand and sediment and lost to history. What do we find then when we look at other sanctuaries outside of Delphi and Olympia? At these sites, at Delphi and Olympia, as well as Epidaurus and Dodona, we find then a similar pattern of construction of churches by gateways. At Epidaurus and at Dodona in the 5th century, they are following a pattern that we see at Delphi and Olympia too. The Basilica Church, newly built right inside the main gate of the sanctuary on the main approach from nearby towns. At Epidaurus, the church was a brand new foundation just to the left inside the gate, as you can see on the left. At Dodona, it was more like Olympia, with the church placed atop a Hellenistic shrine of Hercules between the gate and the unlooted sacred house of Zeus of Dodona. On the right, you can see the Basilica Church of Dodona just near the gate, and the sacred house of Zeus is behind it to the west. The siting of all of these Christian basilicas near gateways suggests that at the time of their construction, at least, the gates and patterns of movement through the sites were still in active use, and moreover, the temple was still seen as the central feature in the landscape. These churches range in archaeological date from the 5th to 6th century, and this seems to be the era of change in Greece for church construction and temple abandonment as well. Next. I'd now like to move on to the 6th century and the noteworthy standing temples in Greece being actively converted into churches. There is a difference in date here from the Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries and also of locale. At Athens and Corfu, as at Rome, Aphrodisias, and other cities outside of Greece, ancient temples were converted directly into churches, largely in major city centers, not in sanctuary towns. And in most cases, a 6th century conversion resulted in the preservation of the building up to the modern era. With a few temple-to-church conversions, we even have some literary or epigraphic evidence to accompany the shift in function and to illuminate the contemporary reasoning behind this shift from new church construction to the reuse of the city's most venerable and ancient central monuments for Christian purposes. Next. Now, Athens, of course, was the most famous of ancient Greek cities in late antiquity, as it is again today, famous for its philosophical schools and its preeminent status in classical history and literature. Archaeology of the classical era continues to dominate scholarship on Athens today, while late antiquity is too often a period to dig through or remove, an era of barbarians and Christians that is better left aside. This situation has been redressed in recent years by the work of the Finnish School and others in Athens, and today there's growing interest in Athenian post-classical monuments, though not entirely reflected in the exhibition of that material. Few traces of the conversion of temples to churches now remain in the Parthenon, or even less so in the Asclepion on the left, which is largely under scaffolding and does not greatly resemble either a temple or a church in the present day. When we move from the Asclepion and the Parthenon, next, to the Erechtheion and the Hephaestion, they were also both long ago stripped of their church features. However, all 4 of these temples were converted to churches in late antiquity, even as some Christian Athenians remained conscious of their long history and former glory into the later periods, and used this history to guarantee a certain status for their city in the newly reformed and revised Byzantine Empire. How did Athenians preserve their civic pride as Christian institutions replaced pagan practices and their major civic shrines? Athens is key for understanding the confrontation of pagans and Christians all around Greece, and 2 things are very clear from Athenian evidence: that pagan worship continued at sites around the Acropolis and the Agora in the 4th and 5th centuries, at least for some, and that in the 6th, or at the latest, the 7th century, all 4 of these major temples were transformed into churches: the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, the Asclepion, and the Temple of Hephaestus in the Agora. Next slide. Who made these conversions? And was competition with paganism actually a factor, or were the pagans all long gone? The sources for continuing traditional civic culture and pagan worship in the Agora, on the Acropolis, and in between at Asclepius' sanctuary include archaeology, inscriptions, orations, and the lives of the Neoplatonic philosophers as well. Local and imperial government continued to function in Athens, at the Agora, and on the Acropolis. The theater of Dionysus, the Agora itself, these places were renovated and used continuously. An imperial palace was built in the heart of the Agora in the 5th century, and emperors and locals were honored with statues all around it. The famous Panathenaic procession and festival in honor of Athena was also celebrated throughout the 4th century. and Neoplatonic schools flourished into the 6th. Next. The orator Himerius composed a description of the festival in the late 4th century in honor of the attending proconsul of Achaia, Basilius, entitled To Basilius on the occasion of the Panathenaea at the beginning of spring, and said to him, I wish to relate to you a detailed account about the customs of the city and the festival to which you are coming. He described the progress of the sacred trireme or ship of Theseus along the Panathenaic way up to the hill of Pallas, the Acropolis, attended by noble priests and priestesses, the Athenians singing a sacred ode. This contemporary, late 4th or probably early 5th century inscription honored the sophist Plutarch for endowing the Panathenaic festival as well. In very flowery and traditional language, the Demos of Erechtheus dedicated this statue of Plutarch, king of speech, king of Logoi, mainstay of firm prudence, who thrice sailed the sacred ship and moored it at the temple of Athena, spending all his wealth. So these are expressions in both epigraphy and in literature of the continued celebration of the Panathenaea in the 4th century. Next. What about the 5th century, though? This era, the 5th and into the 6th century, is customarily viewed through the lens of the Neoplatonic philosophers and the aftermath of the sack of Athens by Alaric and his Goths in 395. And you see there Alaric in the wonderful early 20th century imagining receiving all the nobles of Athens in the Parthenon. Maybe he did that, maybe not. But this era certainly involved a lot of increasing political instability in Athens and around it, and the process of Christianization was gathering steam as more and more people were converted and more new churches built. The focus of discussion on the Neoplatonic Academy, the philosophical school, often to the exclusion of other institutions, has tended to highlight private pagan activity in the city and downplay the existence of public officials and events. The literary sources do seem to indicate that pagan worship, at least among the philosophers, was an increasingly marginal, esoteric, and socially unpopular activity in Athens in the 5th century. Alison France has postulated a deeply divided city in this era, with a pagan heart and a Christian periphery, an upper class of intellectuals and a lower class of Christians. But this is a simplistic picture, and it's important to look at the archaeological evidence as well as the literary sources to try and see where the churches are built and when the conversions really happened. Next slide. It seems that the tetraconch building set into the courtyard of the Library of Hadrian was the first purpose-built Athenian church, possibly dedicated by the Athenian empress Evdokia Athenias, wife of Theodosius II, in the 2nd quarter of the 5th century. It lay inside the post-Herulian fortification wall and was connected with the ancient agora and the new palace there by a colonnaded processional way. This tetraconch church may have superseded a site in the library that was partly dedicated to imperial cults, but it was not previously a temple or a site of worship of the old gods. On the other side of the Roman agora, the old agora still had the temple of Hephaestus standing prominently. A brand new basilica church was then also built on the Ilissos River outside of the city center, hardly very far from the Acropolis, but on the routes out of the city and likely used for cemetery activities. Next. In the Asclepion, though, on the south slope of the Acropolis, it seems to be the first case in Athens of a pagan temple to be replaced outright by a church right on top of it, perhaps dedicated to St. Andrew, as the spring there today still is. And you can see the spring on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side is the Asclepion, as it is today, with both temple and church material spread out and awaiting restoration. Unlike subsequent temples, however, on the Acropolis and the Agora, which were internally modified for the new worship, the Asclepius sanctuary was completely destroyed and rebuilt, although on almost the same plan and foundation as before, and reusing much of the old stonework. The date of this reconstruction, new stonework, and mosaics probably took place at the very end of the 5th century. The Asclepion was certainly in use, however, between 450 and maybe even as late as 485. During that time, Plutarch the Athenian sought a cure in the traditional way by sleeping in the temple, and when he questioned the god's cure, Asclepius immediately sent forth out of the statue a very harmonious voice and presented another treatment for the malady, says Damascius's Life of Isidore. When the philosopher Proclus also prayed there at the Asclepion for a friend, his biographer says the city still enjoyed the god's presence at that time and still held the temple of the Savior unravaged. His biographer and successor, Marinus, saw it destroyed sometime after Proclus and Plutarch's visit, and before the composition of the Vita in the late 5th century. Was worship at the new church then seen as a successor to the old cult of Asclepius and a better replacement? It is possible, and has recently been argued by A. Caravieri, and it could be paralleled at least in one other Greek city. Next. When we look at Corfu, we find also a church completely replacing a temple at around this time, interpreted clearly by its converter as triumph over paganism. It's dangerous to draw sweeping generalizations, but this direct destruction of a pagan temple and its total replacement by a church has an epigraphic justification. In the town of Paliopolis on Corfu, Kerkyra, a basilica was constructed atop a temple in the late 5th or early 6th century by the local bishop Jovian, who bragged in his dedicatory inscription on the lintel over the entrance to the new church that he had destroyed pagan altars and constructed a church in their place, although his bragging was done in very archaic Greek with conscious echoes of lines from the Iliad and the Odyssey. Jovian's attitude may have been more usual than his methods, but it is possible that churches in Philippi, in northern Greece, as well as certainly at Aphrodisias and elsewhere, were built directly atop temples and using many of the same architectural members. In this particular picture, you can see the foundation of the temple at the bottom of the slide and the church built directly on top of it. Next slide. Two further points support the conversion of the Asclepion in Athens as a late 5th century event of deep significance. It is not coincidental that the temple of Asclepius was the first chosen to be destroyed and replaced, as Asclepius was known as the savior, Sotir, and was a healing god, and thus one of the main competitors for the new religion. The earliest Christian cemetery known today in Athens was also around the Asclepion on the south slope of the Acropolis, in use even while the philosophers claim the Asclepion was still in use by them too. In vivid contrast to the Asclepion, Athens' other most famous temples, the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and the Hephaestion, were all modified much less drastically to serve as Christian churches, probably in the last phase of conversion, in the 6th or even early 7th centuries from the epigraphic evidence. Mostly inscriptions giving the burial place of bishops in these various new churches. There is literary evidence, however, only for conversion of the Parthenon, and like at Olympia, it is concerned with the cult statue rather than the temple itself. Next slide. Prior to his death in 485, the Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus dreamt that Athena Parthenos asked for a place in his house to sleep after her statue seated hitherto in the Parthenon was moved by those who move unmovable things. in a Neoplatonic way of speaking, by, again, his biographer. This seems to mean that the statue, the great Elephantine Athena of Phidias, was transferred somewhere else, and Christian worship could therefore begin sometime afterwards in the building that she had vacated. As I mentioned, however, the first dated inscriptions of Christian bishops in the Parthenon only date from the 7th century. However, the statue was clearly targeted by Christians for removal in the 5th century, just like the Phidian Zeus at Olympia. When the Parthenon became a church in the 6th or 7th century, most of the exterior sculptures on the pediments and the metopes were either removed from their heads or removed altogether, while the internal modifications included an apse at the east and the opening of a new door between the interior spaces to form a basilica. There was also the addition of Christian decoration like wall mosaics and the like, although almost nothing of that is left today. In fact, the only real evidence of the Christian Parthenon that still survives is the staircase up to what was once the bell tower. And the staircase is still there, despite all of the deconstruction and reconstruction. And I gather it's going to remain there for some time to come. Next slide. When we move from the Parthenon, however, similar interior work seems to have been done in the Erechtheion as well. Interior modifications and exterior ones too. When we look at the Erechtheion, we see the famous caryatids are still there and undisturbed, but the small sculptures that used to decorate the frieze all the way around are incredibly fragmentary, and none of them have their heads anymore. Similarly, when we look at the Hephaestion, the temple of Hephaestus, the metopes are still in place, but the heads of the figures are missing, and the pediment sculpture has entirely vanished. Internally, again, there was construction of an apse at the east and a door at the west. The conversion, it seems, of these three Athenian temples outright into churches, rather than their destruction and rebuilding, or replacement by nearby basilicas, represents the last phase in the rise of Christian architecture and the conversion of people and landscapes to Christianity, especially to judge from comparative evidence from Rome and Asia Minor, as well as the East. The first certain temple-to-church conversion in Rome happened in 609 or so, when the Pantheon was gifted by the Roman, let's say Byzantine Emperor Phocas to Pope Boniface IV in order to be converted into a church. The later historian John the Deacon states that in order to convert this building, that is the Pantheon, there were two necessary steps: to remove the pagan filth, in practice the pediment sculpture outside in the Pantheon's pediment, and the cult statues and altars inside, Venus, Mars, and the rest. And then step two, to establish the worship of Mary and all the martyrs, to replace the worship of these old, quote, demons, not gods. There seem to be no earlier examples of the conversion of actual temples at Rome to churches, although many ancient secular buildings had already been reused in the urban center, and new churches built too, of course, on the periphery, from the Basilica of St. Peter to that for St. Paul and St. John Lateran. These modifications at Athens thus agree very closely with the conversion of the Pantheon in Rome, as well as some temples in the East as well. The conversion of the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, the Hephaestion in Athens, and the outright replacement of the Asclepieion, all of these things suggest that the religious space of Athens was indeed contested, but then utterly transformed in the 5th through 7th centuries, in distinct phases, from new church construction to replacements, and then last of all, conversions. Next slide. While the exact dating of many of these churches and conversions I've discussed is controversial, usually only to within half a century or so, there are some clear conclusions that emerge from this pattern of construction and conversion of churches in late antique Greece. The construction of a church should not be taken to indicate the first Christian worship at a site or the last pagan use. Even after new Christian basilicas were built or renovations made to old temples, some temples or pagan sacred sites may have remained in use. To be a place of worship, a temple just needed to exist. It didn't need to house a cult statue anymore or receive offerings. The god would still be there, as long as local people believed in it. In its first phase, the 4th and 5th centuries, when spolia from temples was not usually used in the construction of churches, temples were still standing and may have functioned as holy sites, or at least central sacred sites in the landscape adjacent to new churches. But in the 5th and especially the 6th century, when temples were entirely replaced by churches on top of them or converted, a message of the triumph of Christianity would have been clear. For many Christians, the use of pagan spolia symbolized the defeat and disgrace of the pagan buildings and pagans themselves. At the destruction of the sanctuary of Zeus Marnas in Gaza in 402, Bishop Porphyry deliberately used blocks from the old temple to pave the atrium in front of his new church, and this was interpreted as follows by his biographer, Mark the Deacon. He did this so that these blocks would be trodden on not only by men, but also by women and dogs and pigs and other animals. This pained the idolaters more than the burning of the temple. In the East, this sort of violent destruction of temples and their replacement happened in the late 4th and 5th century, and conversions are very unusual. The most famous and violent destruction of sanctuaries are this example of the Marnion at Gaza and also the Serapeum in Alexandria in 392. In these better historically documented cases, a long and complex history of conflict among locals, bishops, and imperial officials usually led up to the actual conversion or destruction of the temple. In the case of Gaza, the emperor, in fact, was unwilling to offend the pagan majority, at least in the sources, and it was the empress who provided the funds and persuasion for the persistent Bishop Porphyry to accomplish his goals. In Greece, the construction of churches at sanctuaries from the 5th century onwards was followed in the cities by some temple replacements and some temple conversions. Belief and worship of the old gods was contested by rival buildings and then actively marginalized and erased by the gradual removal and sometimes the active destruction of statuary, the marking of buildings, and altars with the sign of the cross, and in a few cases, the wholesale replacement and conversion of temples. A striking change in many sanctuaries is the appearance of basilica churches by gateways, as well as Christian burials within the sanctuary, polluting a place for pagans and sanctifying it for Christians. By the 7th century, all the temples of Greece were either left to decay, actively pulled down and replaced, or in the cases I've highlighted, converted to continue their service as sacred buildings. It is these temple churches which have lasted up to the present day, while most of the new churches joined the old temples in falling into ruins. Yet the placement of the new churches, the survival of the temple churches, and even the state of affairs of the old temples not converted or replaced, all of these things reveal that at Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries and in Greek city centers, the temples of the old gods were sites of active competition in late antiquity. Thank you.
Amelia, thank you very much for this panorama of temple conversions in Greece and beyond, and for discussing this very interesting and popular subject in late antique studies. And I have many questions, but I'll keep them for later. Okay. Are there any questions from the audience?
If you go forward one slide as well, there's a last slide for the question time.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
It doesn't go further.
There should be one. No?
Αλλά... Okay. Any questions? No.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Never mind.
We'll keep that then.
Any questions? I'll do the translation if necessary.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first regards the city of Philippi, Macedonia. I was wondering if that would be a good example, with the first basilica being built next to the Heron.
Yeah.
And yeah. And if you would like to comment on that. And then my second question regards the marking of buildings, of which some pictures you showed us from Delphi. And I was wondering what kind of activity you imagine this would correspond to. Would it be competition between religious groups, or changing the identity of the building? Or I don't know, what kind of social activity you think?
I think to answer your first question, Philippi is a very good example too, with the placement of the churches there, and also the very good possibility that the octagon replaced also a sacred building that was underneath it. So I need to look into the examples from the north of Greece more for including in this area of research. For your second question, there's kind of two different ways of marking of the buildings, positive and negative. The negative, I would say, is the removal of things, particularly the removal of heads from the figures of gods and heroes and what have you. And that does seem to accompany definitely the conversion of the building in the case of the Parthenon and of the Hephaestion. For example, that seems to have been done in some kind of organized way by the builders who were sent to do the work. But I'd like to have a little bit more knowledge about that. But it does seem, at least the tool marks show that they're using, builders' tools. They're using hammers and chisels, and they're not just, casually doing this, but really systematically taking off heads, or in the case of many of the metopes of the Parthenon, shaving the metopes down as well. That's the negative. The positive is the actual imprinting, particularly of the cross upon buildings. And the two most prominent examples of that are the altar of the Chians outside the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, and actually the greater propylaea at Eleusis, which is also covered with these roundels with the Cairo and with the cross marks. And there, it's very hard to date these things, and it's also hard to say if it was just done over the course of a few days, a few weeks, months, years. The style of the crosses does seem to belong to late antiquity, but whether it was religious groups, small groups, big groups doing it in the dead of night or during the day, there's again a real lack of good evidence for the intention behind the people doing these things. Not a whole lot of people wrote about doing graffiti and why they did it or when they did it. But there are also some statues where the two things come together, like the bust of Marcus Aurelius from Eleusis, where there's also a big prominent cross scratched on his breastplate. And in order to do that, of course, he would have had to either get up on the gateway and put it there, or get the bust down and do it on the ground. So, good question.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you very much for this interesting comparison of these different religious landscapes. I would like to know, what do you think the conversion of ancient temples into churches? Do you believe that influenced also the early Christian architecture?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the most important influence on early Christian architecture by far are the basilicas built by Constantine. I think his choice of the basilica form, which had, I think was more for practical reasons, that it was a good-sized gathering hall that was used for many different purposes in Roman architecture. I think his choice of that form, and especially then his sons also continued use of that form for their new churches in Rome, in Constantinople, adjacent to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. These monumental halls, and I think the artwork as well of those places, that was the most significant inspiration in the 4th and 5th centuries for church construction. But as time went on, and there were more and more new churches built, I think there must have been some influence as well from existing pagan artwork and architecture too. But the temple was not necessarily actually entirely suited for Christian worship. When you look at places like the Parthenon, they really did have to take quite a lot out of the inside in order to make it a functional church. And I don't think it could ever have fit the number of people as, for example, Old St. Peter's. But that was okay, because you had the Erection and Hephaestion and the other, and the new churches too, that were bigger inside.
Okay. Something then. The question that we missed.
Yeah, I think you can hear me. We just have a question which can't be seen on the screen. So it's from Amelia, saying greetings from Lebanon first. How often would they celebrate masses? I ask because the Hephaestion is dedicated to Saint Ioannis Akamatis, that have only held service once.
So, that's a good question. To get back into the frequency of celebrations, it seems that to start with, the major festival of the saint would be the festival time when they would actually have a service in the church, but quite quickly many rituals that were previously done outside or at the home or in different places came to be held in the church, particularly funeral rituals for the death of prominent people and the people who were going to be buried either in or near the church, and many Christians were buried in and near the Hephaestion, in fact, all the way up until the 19th century, and as well as in the Parthenon, for example. So you have the rise of funeral masses and celebrations, and then later on, weddings also come to be celebrated in the church, and baptism, to start with, is only celebrated once a year. And then again in the 6th, 7th, 8th century, it comes to be celebrated much more frequently, that you can be baptized not just once a year, but when you're done with the process of being a catechumen, or whenever the bishop decides that you're ready. So there's, I think, to start with, a small number of masses, but as time goes on, more and more being held, especially with the rise of monasteries as well, and monastic use of churches, which is another whole story.
Anybody else? We have a few students here who wrote an essay on this subject. So, any question from this side? Any questions from... there it comes. Thank you for this very informative presentation. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the nature of literary sources.
That's a good question, because I mentioned there are these biographies, biographies of philosophers and also of people, of early Christian figures like bishops. So you have one genre of literature, the biography, which is usually only shortly after the death of the person, but of course in most cases wants to portray the person in the best possible light. Then there are also the histories, chronicles really, and those are moving more and more to very short entries. So you have the last really, I would say, extensive histories, particularly of Procopius in the 6th century, but at the same time you have the shift towards very shorter and shorter annals and chronicles too that are popular in the Byzantine period. So you do, in the historical sources, also have a problem of the attention of the writer, and the historians do tend to focus very much on the emperors in this period and what the emperors were doing, wars mostly. And in the case of the Byzantine emperors, that means the focus narrows down more and more to Constantinople or wherever the emperor is at the time. So biographies, histories, then you have hagiography, saints' lives, as a kind of subset of biography, I suppose, emerging at this period. And hagiography does become an important source for information about Greece, conditions in Greece, but only quite a bit later on in the Middle Ages. It's not so much for late antiquity.
And of course inscriptions are very helpful.
Yes.
Even though also very few in most cases, especially in Greece.
The literary sources are joined by the epigraphic material, and we have enormous quantities of gravestones, most of all, when we look at epigraphy. For example, at the site of Corinth, I would say probably, at least 3/4 of the Christian epigraphy of late antiquity is gravestones. And these can be very interesting and informative, but beyond that, there are fewer and fewer dedicatory inscriptions. There are also fewer dedications of churches with an inscription, but when we do have one, I think they're very, very helpful indeed, for example, for Bishop Jovian, or even for some of the mosaic floors at Nicopolis, for example.
But we have to, I think, if I may allow the comment here, even when we have, plenty of information from inscriptions, texts, good archaeology, good stratified excavation, still it's not an easy task to describe and assess and understand this transition from paganism to Christianity. And for many of the narratives that you presented, the late history of these very famous Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. Many aspects of these narratives can be contested and debated, and is being debated all the time.
Absolutely. So much of the literary evidence and the epigraphic evidence concerns individuals, spots and points in time, specific people doing things, putting up texts or writing texts for a specific purpose about one individual doing something, and why that one person did that thing. and then it's that one writer's opinion why that thing was received in the way it was, the interpretation of that writer. So it is, I think, important to balance out the ancient interpretations given to actions with modern interpretations, and to say, well, at least a few people at the time in the 4th or the 5th or the 6th century, at least a few people put this interpretation upon this action.
Okay, there is another question from a colleague, Adriani Georgiou. It's generally admitted that numismatic material is important in understanding the massive cultural and political changes witnessed in the late antique period. How coins are used in your investigation to aid in the interdisciplinary interpretation?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I did not refer explicitly to coin evidence in the presentation, but in fact it is the backbone of the chronology of the churches to a great extent. The dating that has been applied to the construction of these churches in the absence of epigraphy has largely been the coins that are found in the masonry of the buildings or underneath the floors, and those provide the point at which, after which the church has to have been built. So that's a kind of archaeological use of the coins that has been very common. When there aren't any coins in the construction of the church, then they tend to look at the stonework, the architectural sculpture, or if that is lacking, then mosaic style, for example. But there's a broader use of coins too. The imagery on them, particularly Constantine and his sons, but also Theodosius and Justinian, and what sort of imagery, whether pagan or Christian, these emperors put on their coins. Even whether they chose to show themselves as bearded or beardless was very charged in symbolism.
But none of the sites that you presented were properly excavated, so we don't have coin reports from any of these sites, and that's the problem, that most of these sites were excavated a long time ago, and we don't have proper excavation reports. And I know only 2 or 3 cases where we have, a coins used for the chronology of temple conversion. I mean, I think for this year's, there is a report of a coin found there. I think the imperial temple at Eretria, I think there is a mention of a coin there. So the cases are very, very, very few.
They are. There are many more for the new basilicas, of course, but for the conversions, I think those are the only examples that I can think of as well.
So it always requires a lot of guesswork and different scenarios that should be equally acknowledged.
One thing I didn't also devote much to was the laws. And of course there are multiple laws all through the 4th, 5th, and 6th century which bear upon pagan buildings, what's to be done about them, that they're not to be destroyed, that they're not to be taken from public to private property, but also that sacrifice is not to be performed, that dedications are not to be performed, and the legal, the body of legal opinion is very broad. Many of the laws bear upon the condition of temples and the use of temples. But again, they're very individual cases. They're laws issued to one particular magistrate, one particular governor. They are laws that are collected long after the fact, and the collection may be done in Constantinople, but it might not be enforced. The enforcement of the laws, too, is a very big gray area, with no police force, with the Roman army spread out and engaged in all different activities. with bishops and monks, sometimes participating in violent activities in the East, but with very little evidence for what they were doing in Greece other than making local officials and that sort of thing. So the legal evidence also is a relevant area. Mm-hmm.
There's a question there. About. There's a question there about Parthenon, and our student asks about what we know about the pediments.
Yes.
The pediments of the Greek pediment of the Parthenon.
Right.
Was it destroyed?
That's one reason why I chose this picture, and there are some wonderful drawings by Manolis Korres as well that you can find, where he has taken the sculpture and the architecture insofar as it's preserved, and he has made a reconstruction of what is most likely to have happened. Certainly the apse did interfere with the eastern pediment and the center of the eastern pediment. The central sculptures would have had to be removed.
They had to be removed, right.
They had to be removed in order to build that eastern apse.
But the western one preserved more or less intact.
They did not.
That's very interesting.
Disturbed. Yeah. And in the east, notice that the figures in the corners, which were not disturbed by the architecture, they were left in place. Whereas on the west, there was no architectural need for their disturbance, but there was still targeting of the heads. And on the east, you can see a very systematic erasure of the metopes all the way across. There's also a famous metope on the north side which was left intact, and this shows a figure, a seated figure, and a standing figure with wings, and it's been said that this was left because of its resemblance to the Annunciation, but I think that's a modern interpretation. We're not sure if that was the late antique justification for leaving that there.
Regarding Parthenon, if I may add a comment that there is a tendency now to explain the preservation of ritually disrupted or abandoned temples to some extent intact as a way to preserve or as a symbol of local pride for the communities, even Christianized.
Yes.
And I think it's definitely the case for Parthenon, and maybe it was the same for Olympia, as you said. And this wall is very, very strange there, and we have also a wall now believed to be a portico in Epidaurus. So was it a kind of arrangement for preservation of old sculpture, old buildings, or was it something else?
I think civic pride is a very important factor here, and a pride in history, local history, the local legacy. And in Athens, we have some information anyway from the Middle Ages that these buildings were cherished not just as great churches, but also because of their great antiquity. And there was still, for example, a lamp that never ran out of oil, a sort of miraculous lamp that never ran out of oil in the Parthenon, which could have even been something that dated from before Christian times and had been preserved. Definitely the statuary at Olympia, I think, shows clear traces of having been respected and preserved, and that is in very great differentiation from Delphi, where the pediment sculpture was almost entirely destroyed on the Temple of Apollo.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay.
And what about the imperial temples? So how many examples do we know of the temples of the Roman emperors that have been converted into churches?
That's a very good question. And imperial cult is a all sort of separate area in a way. There are certainly places of imperial cult in Rome that are converted to churches but outside of Rome, in Greece, it seems that there was imperial cult in Athens, for example, happening in this temple of Roma and Augustus at the east side of the Parthenon, and that building was completely taken apart and not replaced by a church. There may have been imperial cult going on in the Library of Hadrian, which was replaced by the Triconch Church there. Elsewhere, in Corinth, we have definitely imperial cult in the Julian Basilica, and there's still a lot of debate about whether the Julian Basilica was renovated to be used as a church or whether it was not.
But Julian Basilica was not exactly a temple.
No, but it had statues of the emperors where they were offered, cult.
We don't have an explicit example of conversion of the Roman emperor to the church.
I can't think of one, but there was also not very many new purpose-built buildings of that kind. I suppose the Temple of Ares in the Agora that had been moved from outside of the city, and that is completely destroyed. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Just to add, there is a hybrid case. It was the Sebastian in Aphrodisias, where there's a long porticos with sculpture, with reliefs about the myth of the local city, and there you have a very careful destruction of very provocative scenes only, and the rest of the sculpture is preserved. It's
the
local pride.
The gods are really targeted at that, the Sebastian reliefs at Aphrodisias.
Some of the
figures of the gods.
Yeah, the figures of the gods.
And a few of the heroes, whereas the emperors are all left.
Were left intact. And yes. And also altars were destroyed.
Not destroyed. Yeah.
But from a distance, you would think that the monument is fine.
It's only when you look close up you see specific gods and heroes have been removed from the reliefs there.
Okay, then if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you very much for this paper, and thank you for coming. And there is a buffet outside, so join us for some Cypriot wine. Thank you.